Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community. As always, it's a pleasure to bring you the following stories of encounters with the horror of the paranormal. These are stories that are difficult to understand, to believe, but very likely resemble those experienced by people very close to us. You have a great episode ahead, and I'll take this opportunity to remind you that if you're easily suggestible, this might not be the best option to listen to tonight. Perhaps it's better to wait for daylight. But listen to it during the day, when the spirits aren't so close to you. Welcome. You're entering the following Tales of the Night. For as long as I can truly remember since I've had the use of reason, I was terrified by the idea of sleeping alone. My whole family knew it. It was an affliction that simply wouldn't leave me. Fortunately, I always had my siblings at home, because it was truly a completely irrational fear that paralyzed me. Whenever there was an outing, when my siblings left, or there was any possibility, however remote, of me being left alone, I ended up at a relative's house. As an adult, when I got my first job, I finally moved away from my parents' house. But I never dared to do it alone. I always had roommates, always had apartment companions. When one left, I would return home. And then I was fortunate to have a girlfriend who always understood this strange phobia I had. I moved in with her and she always supported me. Her best friend lived very close to our apartment, and when she had to go out, she would tell him to stay at the house. I don't know what pretexts or what she might have invented, but her friend would always stay in the living room playing video games with me until very, very late, and then sleep there until she returned. I also have to clarify that in my house, when I was a child, they never explained the origin of this fear to me, but they always did everything possible to take care of me. I was never questioned, never treated as if it were something unreal or absurd. Not at all. That always made me believe that there had to be some reason, but if I had known it at some point, I didn't remember it. A few weeks ago, we received a call that woke us up alarmed. As always, a phone ringing at 2:00 a.m. is worrying. It was my girlfriend's best friend's mother. He had had an accident. They didn't know how he was. They didn't even know which hospital he had been taken to. They only knew what a police officer who called from his personal phone could tell them. My girlfriend knew which area her friend was in, as always. And at that moment, she left the house to go look for the lady and help her find her son. Of course, I offered to go with her, but our car is one of those very small ones. For 2 people, very tiny. And so if I went, I would simply be in the way. So I stayed. And she left so quickly that I didn't realize, until the apartment was filled with silence, that it had finally happened. That I was alone. That I would spend that night, very likely, completely alone in that place. It was too late to go to my parents' house or to call someone. I felt that somehow life had led me to that moment, to face my phobia, to overcome it that night perhaps. So I did it. I pretended I wasn't afraid. I stayed waiting for my girlfriend's friend to be okay, for them to find him soon, for it to have been a misunderstanding. I tried to fall asleep and not think, until I succeeded. My eyes closed. My body seemed to be led glued to the bed, unable to get up. The door was heard. My girlfriend had returned. I wanted to open my eyes, ask her if everything was okay, if they had found her friend, but I couldn't. I was very tired. I couldn't lift or open my eyes. I could only hear and feel when someone lay down in my bed, with me. I was awake. I was conscious. My mind was, but my body wasn't. Suddenly, the person beside me got closer. I felt fabric, as if they were wearing a very old and hard, stiff sweater. Then I perceived a horrific smell like garbage. It stung my nose. I heard how that person next to me was breathing with difficulty. Minutes passed, hours passed, almost the whole night passed. I slept for moments and then became conscious again that there was someone there. That's how I felt when it got up. When it left the room, it closed the door. I stayed like that, motionless, unable to move, unable to react, unable to open my eyes. I fell asleep and woke up with the morning light. When my girlfriend arrived, the first thing I did was remember the fear, what I had felt. But my girlfriend asked me what the hell was in her place. I realized it was full of hair, dirty, black, very long hair. She asked me where it had come from, and I explained what I had seen, what I felt I had dreamed. And although it was hard to believe, it made no sense that I had brought someone into my house in the early morning. Even so, my girlfriend got angry. It didn't make sense, but she got angry. She yelled at me very violently, in a way I had never seen. It seemed like it wasn't her. She asked me to leave, and so I ended up returning to my house, to my room. At least for a couple of days while my girlfriend could, I don't know, come to her senses. Or at least that's what I hoped. 3 days later, she came looking for me at my house, crying, and asked me to come back with her to the apartment because she had something to tell me. The first thing she did was explain how something had made her lose control that time she arrived, not to see the facts. First, she understood that that hair couldn't be from a woman, but something, a voice seemed to speak to her, advise her. It told her that I was making fun of her, and that made her break. But that night she had the same fear, the phobia that I had suffered all my life. When she was preparing to go to sleep, she felt an uncontrollable fear, something she couldn't explain, that she didn't know where it came from. She took some very strong sleeping pills. Unable to open her eyes, she heard the door. A stench entered the room and then something lay down next to her. She tried to open her eyes but couldn't, until finally that thing got up. She said she managed to open them a little, that she saw blurry but still managed to see how someone was leaving our room. Then, before going to sleep, when she thought for a moment about calling me to come, to tell me that she didn't want to sleep alone, that voice in her head again started to speak to her, making her feel that she had no reason to call me. In the morning, she noticed that the other side of the bed was full of those same black hairs, but many, many indeed, as if half the hair of that woman who had entered had fallen out. She didn't look for me, but she wasn't going to stay there alone for another night. So she went to her friend's mother's house, where he was recovering from the accident. Something that wasn't so serious, but his mother was very old, and with the pretext of helping to take care of him, my girlfriend was able to leave the apartment that night. But something happened there, even though we weren't there. And the next day, several neighbors wrote to her. Our bedroom has a window that faces the interior of the building. Directly in front of it is the window of another apartment on the same floor, and in fact you can see the other bedroom windows of that tower. That night the whole building heard a door opening and closing incessantly all night. A noise that came from our apartment. Some knew that that night it was empty. And there was something else. 2 neighbors, separately, said they had seen something in our window. Something standing there, looking outside. A lady. A woman of very dirty appearance, of terrifying appearance, especially because she had no lips. She had no skin around her mouth, leaving her teeth exposed in a ghastly and permanent smile. We left for a few days, and there a priest, a very good friend of my father, was going to pray so that we would have some peace, so that anything that shouldn't be there would leave. This priest has known me since I was a child, and I suppose he knows something. He told me not to neglect myself, to please not stop paying attention to my fears, to never ever sleep alone again. And so I find myself, community, thinking that if I do it again, she will come back. Thinking that if I do it again, I'm going to end up realizing why that fear exists in me from before I can remember it. We continue community with this episode. And if you're not yet part of it, if you're listening to us for the first time or simply haven't decided to subscribe, remember that it's free, and that at that moment you become part of the best community on the internet, of the Tales of the Night community. Let's now go to Chiapas with the experience shared by Julio Rodriguez. Don't go away. I promise you're going to like this story. Hello. Good evening. I want you to know that I really like your content. Many of the stories shared here seem really impressive to me. I want to tell you mine. A story that belonged to my grandfather to tell. Unfortunately, it's been a year since he passed away, but I want the story to always remain in my memory. That's why I want to share it with you. Sorry if I don't know how to write well, but I'll make an effort to tell it to you as he told it to me so many times, from his perspective, in first person. I'd like for a moment for all those who listen to imagine that you are grandchildren of my grandfather, that you let yourselves be carried away, and imagine him telling it to you. This is his story. I remember when I was a child, around 8 years old, when I used to hang out with my little brother, who was 2 years younger. You've probably noticed that I don't usually talk about him. It's not easy for me, because of what I'm going to tell you next. My brother and I had my dear mother and my father, my old man, but we were very poor. Sometimes we didn't even have anything to eat. I remember my dear father who worked hard every day in the fields to be able to bring something for us to eat, whatever it was. We would figure out how to make it last. Although many times my dad and mom wouldn't eat. They were terrible times, truly terrible. But I have to confess that as a child, you don't end up seeing it in that desolate way that we do when we're grown up. Despite all the shortages we had, I was very happy with my brother. Like every child, I didn't see beyond what was really happening. I just wanted to play. But then everything got worse when my dad fell ill. Unfortunately, something bit him when he was in the field. Later, we found out it was a scorpion. My father died, and from those days, what I remember is that my mother cried every night. It made me very sad, son. But what could I do at 8 years old? The situation got worse for us, and even worse days came. But my mom, as the strong woman she always was, started to move to look for work, one after another, and one after another, until she found one as a weaver. The bad thing is that it was very far from where we lived, but there was no other choice. I remember very well that she would leave very early and come back very late. We hardly saw her anymore because when she left we were still sleeping, and when she returned we had already gone to bed. That's when she told me that as the older brother I had to take care of my little brother, that now I was the man of the house. And so we were for a few months until that damn day came. My brother couldn't sleep. I remember that between dreams he told me that my dad was talking to him, that he heard him out there, and that he was talking to him. I knew it was impossible and believed it was because he still couldn't assimilate his departure. I decided to ignore it. I was falling asleep again when I heard the door of my little house being touched, as if it had been closed very hard, almost with the intention of tearing it down. I got up. My brother was no longer with me. I got up as fast as I could and fearfully went out to look for him. I managed to see what was heading towards the forest on a path near my house. I ran as fast as I could. I went into the forest to look for him, but I couldn't find him. And there I was. I searched and searched and searched until I heard my old man's voice too, but it sounded weird, like very deep. And I started to follow that voice. I started looking for my dad, but in the end I saw who was emitting that voice. I saw a woman, the silhouette of a completely dark woman. I couldn't distinguish her face. My little brother was there, close to her, by her side. He was hypnotized. I shouted at him and she turned to look at me. I remember everything very well, son. You don't know with how much pain I can remember it all. It was my fault. The woman took my little brother and dragged him into the darkness. My brother was screaming at me to help him, but I hid. I was very afraid. Very much, son. But I was only 8 years old. I couldn't defend my brother. I couldn't do anything. It hurts me to think that my brother thought I had abandoned him because I didn't help him. And yes, I was his brother. I should have taken care of him. But at the same time, I was just a child. I've lived with guilt all my life, with the guilt of my cowardice, thinking that because of that, my brother was no longer by my side. I will always have him in my heart. My beloved little brother, and I hope to see him, and that someday he forgives me. That night, when I returned to my house, my mom was already there, worried. As was logical, because she arrived and didn't find us in the house. She looked at me and burst into tears when I saw her. There I had to confess to her what had happened. I remember how her tears wouldn't stop, how they wouldn't stop coming out, how the poor woman was destroyed. After a few days, we left my little house. We arrived at a cousin's house. Despite the pain we felt, we moved forward. And a little later, she confessed to me that my brother had been taken by a witch. That's my grandfather's story. Community. He lived in Chiapas, in a humble little house where he dedicated himself to taking care of his little pigs. He had 5. Every time we went on a trip to visit him, he told me stories, but none as painful as this one. Today, I share it with you, in his honor. Hello, good evening to all who are part of this great community. I would love to share my experience with you because it was an event that continues to be the most terrifying and inexplicable experience for me and my family to this day. What I'm about to tell you is part of the great number of stories that are told on the street where I grew up. Because yes, it's no coincidence that on that street, all the neighbors have witnessed visits from entities that no one has been able to explain. I was in my 3rd year of secondary school, and as you know, being in evaluation weeks, it's very common to stay up very late, and that night for me was one of them. I was finishing a research on Mayan culture, when in the hallway I managed to see the shadow of a man. At first I didn't pay attention to it, since it wasn't the first time I had seen this shadow, but I always covered my face with my blanket until I fell asleep. However, on this occasion I really needed to finish the work that same night, so I decided to ignore it and simply continue with my work. Minutes later I saw it again. There was the silhouette, simply standing at the door. Fear and the sensation of imminent danger invaded my body. I was simply a young girl and I couldn't think of a better idea than to just go to sleep, hoping that it would just disappear like on previous nights. I put my things away and went to bed as quickly as I could. I didn't even brush my teeth. Not even 5 minutes had passed lying in my bed when I felt it. I couldn't see it, but I felt it was in front of me. Only a blanket separated us, which became my only barrier against the unknown. Suddenly, I was invaded by ideas that it was actually a living person who had broken into my house to harm me or my brother, who was sleeping on the other side of the room, Ignacio, who was only 10 years old at that time. My protective instinct as the older sister filled me with courage and determination. I uncovered my face to face whatever was there. That was the worst mistake of my life. What I saw, I shouldn't have seen it. What I saw still gives me chills just remembering it, because it was a specter, a ghost, someone who looked like a real person but with a completely burned face, deformed, and looked in a state of rage and sadness at the same time. My first instinct was to abandon my bed and run downstairs where my parents were. Before leaving the room, I saw it standing next to my bed. It had a hat and a poncho. As I went down, I ran screaming and crying to enter my parents' room. They calmed me down, but I kept telling my dad to go up and check, because my brother had stayed there. because he had been left alone. Not even 2 seconds passed when Ignacio came running down, screaming and crying, saying there was a man with a burned face in the room. My father, more worried that it might be a thief, took a lamp and went up with a bat to defend himself. Several minutes passed in which my father only shouted threateningly, and we heard him walking from side to side up there. This was clearly to scare what he believed to be a real person. He came down with my mom and us and told us that there was nothing there anymore, that it had probably just been a nightmare of mine, and that with my screams I had scared my brother, but that we should stay and sleep with them just in case. As he finished that sentence, exactly as he finished it, on the second floor of my house, it started to sound as if it was full of animals, especially turkeys and goats. That's when my dad, when all of us in the house, realized that whatever we were facing was not a thief, and much less a nightmare. My mother, completely pale, told us, "Kneel down and start praying the Lord's Prayer." The three of us started doing it without hesitation. While we were kneeling and in the dark, we started to feel a force pushing us from behind, as if something didn't want us to finish praying. Our only reaction was to hug each other and start crying. Have you ever cried out of fear? I don't know at what moment we fell asleep. Amid sobs and uncertainty, I realized that it was only my brother and I. My dad and mom were completely alert, trying to protect us from that which they couldn't even see. The next day, first thing in the morning, my mother went to the church for the priest to bless the house. It was 7 days of visits and rosaries in the house to drive away that which had arrived. And thank God, everything we did worked. And yes, it was fixed. But for me, it remains the most horrific episode of my life. Thank you very much, Uriel, for giving time to my story. Hearing it narrated in your voice would be like reliving it. Have a very good night.